Hey everybody, this is chapter 12 of Friedrich Pollock, the Éminence Grise of the Frankfurt School by Philipp Lenhard. Chapter 12 is titled New Old Germany. Utterly inconceivable as it had seemed to him only a short while ago, once he realized he could no longer avoid returning to Germany, Pollock began to feel more pessimistic about his planned life in Los Angeles. Whether this was merely a rationalization in light of his having been unable to persuade Horkheimer otherwise, or generally reflected his assessment of the changing political situation, as he claimed, is a moot point. Either way, by the summer of 1950, Pollock's enthusiasm for California had largely dissipated. On the 25th of June, the Korea War he had anticipated had for some time become a reality. Given that it was a proxy war in which the United States was heavily implicated, he feared that the West Coast might be affected by the hostilities. As he wrote to Horkheimer in Frankfurt, quote, "It seems to me that Korea means that America will develop into a veritable preparedness economy, and that the atmosphere in the most exposed locations, and Los Angeles, including Santa Monica, Douglas Aircraft, is definitely one of them, will become hard to bear," end quote. Consequently, he suggested retreating to a city further inland and proposed Boulder, Colorado. Horkheimer rejected this proposal, explaining that he would rather spend 2 years in Germany and then return to California. Pollock, who assumed that another world war, which would obviously devastate Germany too, was on the cards, considered this too risky and took precautionary measures, quote, "for the not entirely inconceivable case, that we, i.e. you and I and our wives, have to flee Los Angeles," end quote. As he wrote on the 28th of July, 1950, he did not believe that, quote, "the threat of a world war is past for the time being. In fact, it may have increased. As soon as there is an indication that LA or other large cities might be attacked from the air, a mass exodus will begin. It will then be very difficult to find a suitable refuge further inland unless one is prepared in advance. To avoid having to tell myself later that I acted negligently, I have joined a group of Jewish-German businessmen and professionals who intend to buy a motel with 20 units in one of the mountain states. Each member of the group will own 1 unit and will have the right to move in whenever they want. I've signed up for 1 unit each for you, i.e. Horkheimer and his wife, and us, i.e. Pollock and his wife, From today's vantage, Pollock's concerns may seem paranoid, yet in the turbulent immediate post-war years it was indeed hard to foresee what lay ahead. More importantly, perhaps, it needs to be borne in mind that Pollock had experienced once before how a threat all too readily dismissed by many one day had become a matter of life and death the next. This was not an experience he would ever forget. In September 1950, having prepared for the worst, Pollock too made his way to Frankfurt, still in the assumption that his sojourn in the city might be merely temporary. He had a good sense of what awaited him in Germany, both from his earlier trip and for the restitution negotiations he and Horkheimer had begun the year before. As far as the house in Kronberg, which was technically owned by Medan, was concerned, they were forced to settle, not least since the new owners were in no position to offer any meaningful compensation. The case concerning compensation for the suitcase factory that had been forcibly auctioned off was still pending. The proceedings were protracted and throw a telling light on the cynicism and malice of the supposedly reformed beneficiaries of the Nazi regime. Prima facie, the case was straightforward enough. Julius and Hans Pollock owned 97% of the shares in Nördlinger and Pollock. During the Great Depression, the enterprise got into trouble and was forced to take out loans in 1932 and 1934, respectively. As its losses increased, it was no longer able to service the loans. The bank foreclosed, and the property and factory building were auctioned off in August 1935. Thus, the Württembergische Landessparkasse State Savings Bank of Württemberg, were able to acquire the property as well as the machines and other inventory perfectly legally for 150,000 Reichsmarks. The following year, the bank sold the assets on the municipality of Stuttgart. On to the municipality of Stuttgart for 250,000 Reichsmarks, making a handsome profit. To make things worse, in 1941, a court in Amsterdam, where Hans Pollock had sought refuge, insisted that he was required to repay an additional 150,000 Reichsmarks. Yet, quote, the Nazi directors of the Landessparkasse, end quote, had in fact, quote, intentionally brought about, end quote, the financial difficulties of the enterprise. Hans Pollock was only forced to sign up to the second loan of 1934 with its extremely unfavorable terms because, quote, one evening at dinner time, 3 gentlemen from the Landessparkasse turned up, one named Stutzmann or something like that, one in SS uniform, the other in brown shirt, and demanded that I hand over all relevant N&P documentation and the share certificates I kept in my cabinet. I handed over the documents and share certificates, but was refused a receipt. The next day the papers were returned, but neither the share certificates nor, despite my complaint, a receipt. This was rejected on the grounds that they were merely being held in trust for me. End quote. The share certificates were never returned. The bank had simply stolen them. Yet the bank flatly denied this and turned the tables on the Pollock brothers, tormenting them with constant demands that they pay 150,000 Deutschmarks to cover the loan. Juan Pollock was literally penniless when he arrived in Argentina. With a lot of hard work, he was able to establish a small workshop in which he and a limited number of with a lot of hard work, he was able to establish a small workshop in which he and a limited number of staff once again produced suitcases. The fact that the bank, far from refusing to acknowledge the injustice he had suffered, instead sought to harm and humiliate him further yet, affected Juan Pollock badly, and the fear of once more losing everything struck terror in his heart. The older brother vowed to undertake everything within his power to ensure that, quote, the gentlemen in Stuttgart do not endanger the existence you have so arduously created for yourself in Buenos Aires, end quote. Friedrich Pollock himself had already lost all hope that he might ever be compensated, rightly so as it turned out. He never received a penny of his late father's considerable fortune. In the end, the case of the family business was also settled. The Landessparkasse and the municipality relinquished their ridiculous claims. In turn, the Pollock brothers and the Jewish Restitution Successor Organization (acting on the behalf of the Nördlingers, who had still owned the 3% of shares in the company not held by the Pollocks), agreed not to pursue the restitution case any further. Juan Pollock's dogged pursuit of compensation for the curtailment of his professional development and lost earnings eventually led to a belated success of sorts. In 1960, Juan Pollock was awarded, quote, a monthly pension of 600 Deutschmarks for the period from the 1st of November 1953 to the 31st of March 1959, and of Deutschmark 630 from 1st of April 1959 for life, as well as a compensation payment of 7,200 Deutschmarks. In 1965, end quote. In 1965, 20 years after the war ended, the Internal Restitution Authority awarded him 510 Deutschmarks as compensation for his expropriated private assets. It was clear to Pollock from his attempt to seek restitution that the Germans were unwilling to bear any responsibility for what had transpired between 1933 and 1945, and that they were determined, even after 1945, to cover up their own crimes and everyone else's complicity. Nor was there any sign of contrition. The Volksgemeinschaft, in short, was no specter of the past, but continued to function in a barely concealed form. Many of the shiny new Democrats who claimed to have maintained their dignity throughout had been complicit in, or at the very least benefited from, the National Socialist regime of terror, war, and genocide. This insight only intensified Pollock's sense of solidarity at those who had been persecuted by the regime and those who had tried to help them. When relatives or friends reported that the individuals who had helped them were now in dire straits, he promptly arranged for them to receive care packages or small amounts of money. The reconstruction of German democracy did not have the same priority for Pollock as it did for Horkheimer and Adorno. He understood the need for re-education, of course, but he also felt that after the many years of valiant hard work, they had well and truly earned the right to take a step back and live their lives as they saw fit. Yet nothing could have been further from Horkheimer and Adorno's mind. They were busier than ever as they paved the way for the official inauguration of the re-established institute on the 14th of November 1951. Although Adorno, who also returned in 1949, was now the deputy director, Pollock continued to function as the institute's Éminence Grise. Jürgen Habermas, who joined the institute as a research fellow in 1956, recalls Pollock often standing behind Horkheimer's chair in meetings in a way that some students found intimidating. It was undoubtedly Horkheimer and Adorno who were decisive in shaping the intellectual profile of what now increasingly came to be known as the Frankfurt School, but in the initial years following the institute's re-establishment, Pollock also maintained a considerable presence. Few knew what exactly his role or biographical background were, but it is palpable that there was a special bond between him and Horkheimer that set him apart from the other members of the institute. As Monika Plessner, who joined the institute in September 1952, later recalled, it was Pollock, quote, Horkheimer's oldest friend and the only one he addressed with "du," end quote, who welcomed her. Quote, as an economist and financial expert, he was his majordomo, a man of athletic build with large hands. Everything about his demeanor marked him out as the born guardian, bouncy and noiseless in his crepe-soled shoes, parenthesis, all the rage at the time, and parenthesis, he guided me through the building, end quote. In the summer semester of 1951, Pollock took up his position as professorial fellow again and began to lecture on, quote, modern economy and society, structural transformations, end quote. Parentheses, summer semester of 1951, and the theory and practice of the planned economy, winter semester 1951/52. In the summer semester of 1952, he was appointed to a personal chair and lectured on problems of the planned economy. Drawing on his familiarity with cutting-edge research in the United States, he also offered tutorials and research methods for beginners, summer semester 1952, and advanced students of the social sciences, summer semester 1953, respectively. In the winter semesters of 1952-53 and 1953-54, and the summer semester of 1954, he was granted leave to take care of the Institute's affairs in the United States, allowing him to accompany Horkheimer during his tenure as visiting professor in Chicago. Even so, there was no suggestion that they would be returning to the USA permanently anytime soon. Both Pollock and Horkheimer went to considerable lengths, however, not to lose their U.S. citizenship. The research method tutorials were the fruits of discussions within the Institute regarding its first empirical research project, now it was back in Frankfurt, a study of German public opinion commissioned and funded by the U.S. High Commissioner for Germany, John McCloy. Pollock and Adorno took the lead on this project. Officially, Adorno acted as the principal investigator, but it was Pollock who was responsible for the publication of the results. Following the years spent in the United States and the major empirical studies undertaken there, Pollock and his colleagues were well versed in the respective advantages and drawbacks of relevant research methodologies, yet Adorno and Pollock were still not entirely satisfied with the methods they had previously developed and deployed. Principally, the question of how one might best extrapolate robust generalizations from individuals' responses continued to vex them, not least, given that they were uneasy about the extent to which questionnaires and individual interviews generally reflected the full spectrum of opinions anyway. Psychological mechanisms such as repression, resistance, and projection were hard to pin down by empirical means and could be identified only by means of qualitative evaluation. This, in turn, raised complex hermeneutical questions transcending the material itself. It was as though an insurmountable chasm separated the theoretical work from the material, threatening to invalidate both. Its own pioneering work in this field notwithstanding, the Institute's members never abandoned a healthy degree of skepticism regarding the ultimate reach of empirical research of this kind. They had nothing to do with some brand of metaphysically motivated anti-positivism. This had nothing to do with some brand of metaphysically motivated anti-positivism. As Adorno expressly acknowledged in his essay, Scientific Experiences of a European Scholar in America, they learned a great deal from their cooperation with social scientists in the United States. Insofar as critical theory was fundamentally predicated on experience, it was dependent on empirical data, yet the data first needed to be deciphered. It was at this juncture that the critique of positivism and its assumption that data spoke for themselves came into play. In order to make sense of empirical data, one not only needed to reflect constantly on one's methodology, but also depended on extra empirical stimuli. One needed a concept of society and society's workings, and a theory of the life of the soul capable of affording some insight into the functioning of the individuals who form society. One needed to be armed with theories both of the political and of the economy of the soul to read empirical data properly. One needed a command, drawing on Marx and Freud, of the mechanisms, laws, and dynamics governing individuals from within and without, if one wanted genuinely to comprehend what they articulated. When it came to gauging German public opinion so soon after the end of the war, an additional problem arose. How might one take account of the impact of National Socialism and the ways in which it had deformed individuals in their social and psychological makeup? Given individuals' intimate entanglement in the Volksgemeinschaft that was now setting itself in scene as a collective victim of fate, Adorno and Pollock decided that it made little sense for the study to hone in on the isolated individual. It was little more than a hypothetical construct in this context. Consequently, they sought to focus on individuals in familiar group situations in which they would feel sufficiently secure to express their true sentiments. To be sure, this brought with it its own pitfalls, given that individuals might be swayed by peer group pressure, yet to Pollock and Adorno this seemed on balance a price worth paying, given that they saw no other way of gaining genuine sense of German popular opinion. In the winter of 1950-51, 151 groups comprising an average of 14 members each were convened. In total, 1,635 individuals were questioned. The members of each group either knew each other already or belonged to the same social group. Farmers, unemployed, refugees, etc. It was hoped that this would enhance a climate of trust. To the same end, the groups were convened in locations which they were already familiar. The meetings began with a tape recording of a fictitious letter, supposedly written by a U.S. or British officer called Colburn, just two different spellings of the same name, read with an English or American accent, depending on the origin of the occupation forces in the location in question, and presented to participants as being authentic. The letter discussed various issues, including the persecution of the Jews, German guilt, the Allied victory, and democracy. It frequently precipitated, without any further intervention, animated and occasionally emotional discussions among the participants. Only in a second phase did the researchers themselves intervene, reiterating and rigorously defending the claims laid out in the document. There was nothing particularly provocative about the letter. It merely reflected what many UK and US officers presumably did think. Quote, I can say many good things about the Germans. They are hard-working and only rarely insubordinate. They are clean and orderly, and many give the impression of being intelligent. Of course, I do not know to what extent they are independent or just repeat what they have heard elsewhere. I do not find any indication of unusual crudeness and cruelty, but nor are there many indicators that they have taken to heart what was done to people under Hitler, ... Despite the past calamity, many think of themselves as better and more capable than us. They do not want to hear anything of the fact that Hitler started it, ... They are still hostile toward the Jews and use the DPs, in particular, the displaced persons, I'm assuming that means, as a pretense for one-sided judgments. Only very few openly admit that they were Nazis, and those admitting it are often not the worst ones, ... The risk is that tomorrow they will again follow a Hitler or Stalin and will still believe that such a strong man will represent their interests best, end quote. When all the minutes of the group discussion had been gathered up, the transcript ran to 6,000 pages, and evaluated the findings essentially bore out the claims of the fictitious letter. Pollock edited and wrote the introduction to the report. Gruppenexperiment, group experiment, was published in 1955 as the second volume in the Institute's new publication series, Frankfurter Beiträge zur Soziologie, Frankfurt Contributions to Sociology. Both in methodology and content, the study was a milestone in the development of the social sciences in Germany. For the first time, the illusion of a democratic consensus in the early Federal Republic, West Germany, was punctured with empirical means. By distinguishing between public and private popular opinion, it demonstrated that the authoritarian personality type idealized by the Nazis continued to impact democracy. The Germans were nowhere near as reformed as they claimed, the study concluded. Not too surprising, this conclusion met with considerable opposition. In 1957, the Kölner Zeitschrift für Soziologie und Sozialpsychologie, Cologne Journal of Sociology and Social Psychology, published a, quote, critical appraisal, end quote, by Peter Hofstetter. Established in 1948 by René Koenig, himself a former émigré, this was arguably the most significant sociological periodical in the early Federal Republic. Hofstetter was an Austrian military psychologist who had just assumed a chair in political psychology at the Social Science Academy in Wilhelmshaven. I'm not sure if it's how that S and the H relate in that word, but Wilhelmshaven, I'm assuming is how you say it. A member of the Nazi Party, Hofstetter served in the War Ministry from 1937 to 1942 and the Justice Ministry from 1943 until the end of the war. Hofstetter's criticism of Pollock and his colleagues was, by any conventional standard, extraordinarily brutal. Intent on proving that the Germans were still Nazis, they had pre-programmed the outcome by using the fictitious letter. By expecting participants to, quote, shoulder the horrors of Auschwitz, end quote, Pollock and his colleagues had knowingly demanded the impossible. The study's findings needed to be turned from their head onto their feet. It was the former Jewish émigrés who were prejudiced against the Germans, and therefore manipulated their communication with them in a manner that backed them into a corner. This was not scholarship. It was, for the most part, quote, simply an exercise in excoriation, end quote. One can well imagine the unease of the former Nazi, now masquerading as a Democrat, at a study that, quote, essentially seeks to unmask, end quote. For Hofstetter, then, as Wolfgang Bach has put it, the Gruppenexperiment, quote, was indeed a study in prejudice, albeit in the prejudice of its authors, end quote. It fell to Adorno to write a rejoinder for the same issue of the Kölner Zeitschrift für Soziologie und Sozialpsychologie. Adapting a Heine quotation, he wrote that, quote, one should not speak of the noose in the house of the hangman, lest one be suspected of resentment, end quote. The Germans were really in no position to reprimand those who reminded them of their crimes. The, quote, horrors of Auschwitz, end quote, Adorno pointed out, had already been, quote, shouldered, end quote, namely by the victims, not, quote, by those who, to their own detriment and that of their country, do not want to face up to the truth, end quote. The findings of the group experiment, criticism such as that articulated by Hofstetter, and not least the failed restitution cases, convinced Pollock that he was not going to devote his remaining years to Germany's democratic reconstruction. Pollock made no effort to regain his German citizenship and constantly wanted to know from Horkheimer when they would finally be able to leave. Pollock's priority was still the creation of a solid basis for the realization of his covenant with Horkheimer. Global political developments were one crucial factor. Where they would best be able to work undisturbed was another. Working in this context always meant making a contribution to the merging of theory and practice to which their covenant aspired. From this vantage point, the Institute in Frankfurt did more to prevent than foster their work. It was a burden that made the implementation of the covenant's goals more difficult. A memorandum of September 1951 reiterated their commitment to the creation of a micro-utopia in which, quote, the laws of society shall not apply, end quote. Theirs was still a very practical utopian commitment. Adorno's collection of aphorisms, Minima Moralia, which was published in the same year, might in part be understood as a critique of the ideas underpinning Horkheimer and Pollock's covenant. The sixth aphorism in particular, quote, antithesis, end quote, would seem to disavow their vision of dispensing with the laws of society on the micro level. Quote, the nonconformist, end quote, Adorno wrote, quote, runs the risk of assuming he is better than the others and abusing his critique of society as an ideology to serve his own private interests. While groping to turn his own existence into a flimsy image of true existence, he should bear this flimsiness in mind and know what a poor substitute the image is for true life, end quote. Adorno. 1 second. In its radical negativity, Adorno's aforementioned infamous contention that, quote, wrong life cannot be lived in the right way, end quote, is central to critical theory. Yet, understood as an ideological statement, it turns apologetic. If one interprets it to mean that nothing can be done to combat existing injustices because the untrue is all-pervasive, it would follow that it did not matter what one did. Adorno's negativity needs to be understood as an expression of polemical hyperbole designed to provoke a response. His concept of society only seems to collapse into seamless immanence. Inspired by Benjamin's messianism, Adorno believed that humankind could step out of its immanence at any point and create a truly human society. Yet, reliance on this messianic potential became counterproductive and harmful when utopian concepts of a better society were elaborated upon and openly propagated. Since human beings were always beholden to the existing order, their positive utopian concepts were invariably at risk of simply extending the very order they sought to transcend into the future, and thus betraying the actual, concealed but constantly present, utopian potential. This line of thought was very close to Horkheimer's interpretation of the prohibition of the image, which for him rooted critical theory in Judaism. Yet he never applied his version of the ban on elaborated utopian visions to his own utopian covenant with Pollock. For him, critical theory and the utopian inflection of their covenant, interior and exterior, seemed to have coexisted without destabilizing each other, or rather, the interior was supposed to create the preconditions for a future utopian transformation of the exterior too. Yet this was a secret that must not be revealed. Consequently, the hope for reconciliation was ultimately rooted in faith in the good. This was the motivation inherent in the theoretical considerations that motivated Horkheimer's post-war turn to theology and Judaism. In addition, he felt compelled by the experience of being persecuted as a Jew to avow his Jewishness, especially in the land of the perpetrators. Pollock's thought did not acknowledge any such religious vanishing point. Still, a quote Israelite, end quote, as a student, Pollock's personnel file in Frankfurt identified him as a quote dissident, end quote, parenthesis, the pre-1945 term for those not affiliated with any of the recognized religious denominations, end parenthesis. As far as Pollock was concerned, people would lead better lives and be happier if the state systematically catered for their basic needs. The constant fear of losing one's existence and the unrelenting pressure to compete would dissipate, and the ideals he and Horkheimer had to go to such lengths to realize for their interior would automatically come to govern the exterior as well. In this sense, Pollock was more political than Horkheimer, yet Pollock was also criticized for this stance. In the aforementioned memorandum of September 1951, Horkheimer suggested that Pollock's anti-transcendental political rationalism betrayed a lack of imagination and a form of conformism that inclined him to, quote, take the position of the world when push comes to shove, end quote. These traits reflected an obsessional neurosis whose impact could be neutralized only if Pollock learned systematically to, quote, distrust his own instincts and judgments, end quote. Pollock's disaffection with his current circumstances seems to have reached some sort of crisis point in the spring of 1954. This is indicated by the memorandum of the 30th of April, in which he and Horkheimer set themselves a deadline of early August finally to stop, quote, muddling through, end quote, and make definitive arrangements guaranteeing, quote, optimal opportunities for work, political and financial security, and agreeable living conditions, end quote. The memorandum outlined three options. Firstly, they could return to the United States. Secondly, both of them could move to a location in Switzerland or France, in which case Horkheimer would apply for German citizenship, while Pollock maintained his U.S. citizenship for the time being. Thirdly, they could stay in Germany, in which case they might either both become German citizens, or Pollock might try to attain Austrian or Liechtensteinian citizenship, and Horkheimer would try to keep his U.S. passport. In the event they failed to meet their own August deadline, they did come to a decision in October 1954 during a stay in the posh spa resort of Baden-Baden. They again discussed the issue at great length and eventually agreed that they would move to Switzerland. They would seek full retirement or an early release from their duties and both become German citizens. Finally, Pollock would be able to share his life with Horkheimer in a secluded location in the way he had envisaged for so long. He immediately started searching for the perfect location. Not that this definitely resolved the issue. The option of return to the United States continued to feature in their thoughts as a serious alternative for the remainder of their days. In 1952, Horkheimer's name was tacked onto a private bill initially submitted to help Werner Richter, who had returned to Germany and become Vice Chancellor of the University in Marburg, and was therefore in a similar position. The two men were granted the right to keep their U.S. citizenship, provided they returned to the country permanently within 2 years, i.e. by 1954, Following confirmation from the State Department that he indeed needed to meet this requirement, Horkheimer took up a visiting professorship at the University of Chicago in 1954, which he held until 1959. In 1955, a private bill designed to lift this stipulation for Horkheimer and his wife was referred to the Committee of the Judiciary but died there, officially, due to lack of time. Horkheimer continued to return to the United States every 2 years until Schneider v. Rusk, 377 U.S. 163, 1964, finally removed the requirement to reside in the United States for all naturalized citizens. In 1957, Pollock and Horkheimer finally moved to Montagnola in Ticino. Now in their 60s, it was here that they decided to spend the rest of their lives, world politics permitting, They spent 16 years in the United States, followed by 7 years in Frankfurt that were repeatedly interrupted by often lengthy stays abroad. Pollock then spent his final 13, Horkheimer his remaining 16, in Montagnola. In this light, the commonplace that Pollock and Horkheimer returned to Germany after the war seems rather questionable. Montagnola is in Switzerland. Okay, that's the end of chapter 12. Thanks for listening.